Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening on the winter solstice. I hope that you've all had a happy and hopeful solstice and transition moment into the new year. I'm going to be facilitating this evening's conversation. My name is Lou Cornum. Just a bit about me. I was born in Arizona into the Navajo Nation, and I am also a member of the Red Nation. I am chairperson of the East Coast Freedom Council. So I'm speaking to you this evening from Lenape-Hoking, otherwise known as New York City. And we are here tonight to discuss Venezuela. We're going to be talking about the Bolivarian Revolution, the effects of blockades and sanctions on Venezuelan life and politics, and here as well about the recent legislative elections that took place in Venezuela, where a couple of our speakers were recently present in the role of observer. So first, breakdown of the evening. I'm just going to introduce very briefly our speakers and then turn it over to them to offer individual remarks. So after we've heard some observations and analysis, we can open it up into a wider discussion. So if you're joining us on Facebook or on YouTube, you can use the chat to answer any questions that come to you as the speakers are speaking. And I'll have some comrades who are keeping an eye on that, collecting questions. So feel free at any time to ask what's on your mind, and we'll try to address those in the course of the conversation in the second half of this evening's event. So tonight on our panel, I'll introduce our speakers actually in the reverse order of how they'll go. So we'll be hearing from Nick Estes, a citizen of the Lower Brule Sioux tribe, assistant professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico. Nick is also the co-founder of the Red Nation and host of the Red Nation podcast. We are also joined by the director of the Tricontinental Institute, Vijay Prashad, who is an Indian historian and journalist. His most recent book, out of many books, is titled Washington Bullets, A History of the CIA, Coups and Assassinations, available through Monthly Review Press. We'll also be hearing from Reverend Sheri Dickerson, a Black indigenous community activist who is the co-founder and executive director for Black Lives Matter, Oklahoma City chapter. She serves as an associate pastor at East 6th Street Christian Church, located in OKC. And lastly, we'll be hearing from Zoe PC, who is a writer and journalist with People's Dispatch. You can find her work on peoplesdispatch.org, and also join what I hear is a really awesome show with some sick outfits called Give the People What They Want, which happens every Friday at 11 a.m. on the People's Dispatch Facebook page. So this Friday it's going down. And we're actually going to hear from Zoe first. So I'll turn it over to her to give us some initial analysis and remarks. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Nick and Red Nation, for the invitation to share a little bit about the experience I had in Venezuela and the experience I've had for the past couple of years covering Venezuela and the developments of the Bolivarian Revolution. So I was present in Venezuela in December, not as an official election observer, but as a journalist to cover these elections, the parliamentary elections that took place on December 6th. So I thought I'd use my time to talk a little bit about kind of the context of these elections, both in terms of building the Bolivarian Revolution and also the historic tax of US imperialism on the Venezuelan people and on the Bolivarian project. So as we know, these elections took place in a moment of kind of heightened tensions and heightened attacks against Venezuela. Since the pandemic started and was declared a global pandemic back in February, March, although the UN itself called for a ceasefire and a lifting of sanctions globally, the United States ignored these calls and actually used the context of the pandemic to intensify its attacks against Venezuela. So in March, we see Venezuela get denied an IMF loan. We see Venezuelan leaders, top leaders in the government, Nicolas Maduro and other top leaders getting slapped with an indictment and getting, basically a bounty put on their head, $15 million, accused of being the largest and most important drug traffickers in the Western Hemisphere, which is, of course, ridiculous. We wrote actually a series of articles with Vijay about how the DEA itself does not even recognize Venezuela as a key port of drug trafficking. Later, we see, there's an attempted mercenary invasion with U.S. trained mercenaries participating. And essentially, the regime of sanctions has been tightened. And so, amid what is supposed to be a moment of solidarity, of cooperation, of supporting, all of the world to be able to get through this very trying time, the United States has tightened its grip on Venezuela and made it even more impossible for the nation to survive. And so what's interesting is that despite the very, very harsh unilateral coercive measures known as sanctions, despite, the constant threat of military invasion from the United States, despite all of these very, very challenging circumstances, Venezuela has actually been one of the countries, both in the Latin American, in the Caribbean, and in the world, that has actually best confronted the coronavirus pandemic. It is currently one of the nations with the lowest mortality rates, lowest infection rates. And the reason why this has been able to happen is not because, of course, they have, a huge amount of medicine in the country. It's not because they have, a robust, very, very well-funded medical system, which, of course, they would if they were not being strangled by sanctions, because, health infrastructure is one of the largest and most important areas of investment in Venezuela. But it is because of the project of the Bolivarian Revolution. And so throughout the pandemic, we've been speaking to organizations on the ground that have been involved in, for example, distributing food door to door in communities. And so this is not, and of course, this is something that's happened across the world, but in Venezuela, this is happening on a massive scale. There are millions of families that are receiving food boxes once a month through a program that's launched by the government, which is called the CLAP, which is the local committees of supply. And these committees, which are organized across neighborhoods, across the country, are delivering food supplies. With the neighborhood health clinics, they're doing door-to-door visits to test people, to make sure they're doing well, to see how their health status is. They're also making sure that people have the necessary conditions to be in their quarantine, because as we know, as we've seen globally, and especially in the United States, one of the most unequal countries in the world, is that, quarantine measures are great, but if you don't have the conditions, the material economic conditions to remain in quarantine, what does it really mean? It means that the poorest and the most marginalized are getting sacrificed in this pandemic. In Venezuela, because of the very impressive system of community organizations, of local movements, of grassroots movements, they've been able to meet all of these needs and ensure that people are staying in quarantine, ensure that they're staying well, staying healthy, and being able to, protect the population. And so I think the question to be asked is both, how is this possible? And then also, on the other hand, going back to kind of these attacks from the United States, why is this project being attacked so much? And this has to do with, the revolutionary model and the revolutionary project which Venezuela has been building over the past 20 years. And so in these elections on December 6th, this was the 25th electoral process that has taken place in Venezuela since 1999 with a new constitution. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela, and he is kind of the heir of a very strong anti-neoliberal uprising and movement in Venezuela in 1989, which is a Caracazo. And he, after mobilizing and organizing after a failed coup attempt, he finally comes to power in elections in 1998, and he begins to work on what is the Bolivarian project. And so essentially, it's very many things, but I think in its essence, what we see as the Bolivarian project is a political project, a social project, an economic project that seeks to transfer power to organized communities, transfer decision-making of resource distribution to organized communities, and use the economic and resource wealth of the country, of the nation. So that's petroleum, that's mining, that's a lot of different, Venezuela is a very resource-rich country, and use this wealth to support the development and advancement of the people in terms of education, healthcare, public infrastructure, and job creation. So I think these are very key elements to highlight here. And I just wanted to speak to two experiences that I was able to observe on the ground of popular leaders, of community leaders who are building socialism today. So on election day, I had the enormous fortune and honor to accompany a leader, Mariela Machado, who is from the Kaikashi community. This is a settlement project, which is a very Venezuelan term, which kind of refers to a community that was built in an occupied urban area. And this community organized and decided, they identified this plot of land in their community that was owned by a company that wasn't being used productively. So they decided to occupy this land and demand that the state expropriate it and give the community control over this land. And through a long process of struggle, they were able to do this. And from there, they demanded that the state provide them resources to build their own houses and to build their own community. And so now, I think 4 years later, the Kaikashi community is a very impressive housing project. The members of the community, there are about over 100 families that live there. They built their homes with resources from the government, but the people organized to build it. They also built a community kitchen. They built a community computer lab, and they have a small health clinic. And so I think this is a really impressive example of what happens under the Bolivarian Revolution. And so this is not an example of just necessarily the state creating this housing project, which of course there are many examples of, and we can talk about the Great Housing Mission, which is an impressive initiative by the government. Over 3 million houses have been built to be given to families in need. But this is a very impressive example of how people in Venezuela in the Bolivarian Revolution are organized, are demanding what they want for their communities, and are taking action to take it. And so this is one example. And then in another kind of thread of organizing that's just wanted to highlight quickly would be about the communes. And so the communes is something we hear about a lot. It's a historic word. It's a, there are many examples of it across the world, but within Venezuela, the communes are a project that was always on the horizon, was always on kind of the priority of Hugo Chavez to be able to deepen what is the Bolivarian project, because it's not just about transferring resource wealth for the betterment of communities. And it's not just about, making sure that people have access to education. It is all about all of those things, but it's also about something more. And that is a political project wherein the people have the power to take decisions about their communities, to take decisions about what's important to their communities, and to be able to be organized and be able to, manage those decisions. And so this is where the communes come into play. And so there are many different examples of this across the country. There's agrarian communes where people are organized into collectivize the agricultural production, and this agricultural production is both consumed by the community, but also sold maybe to the state, maybe to a private company, and then the resources, the revenue from this sale would be poured back into the community. There are urban communes where people are organized to create community health clinics, to create schools, to organize transportation. And basically in all cases, what the communes are is encouraging the grassroots organization of people, encouraging the direct relationship kind of between the state and what the state represents in terms of resources, and bringing that directly to the communities. And so I think there's so many lessons to learn from Venezuela, from the political project of the Bolivarian Revolution, but also what all of this represents is that this model of participatory democracy, this model of using resource wealth to better communities, is really what's a huge threat to the United States. Because what they have wanted with Venezuela, what they have wanted, with so many countries and nations across the world, is that they want to be able to directly administer these resources. They want to be able to expropriate these. They want to be able to pillage people's resources and wealth for their own good. And when you have a project where people are empowered, where people know exactly what belongs to them and what they should be demanding, you no longer are able to take control over these resources. And so that's why we see when the mercenary invasion happens in May, it's not just the Bolivarian National Guard that expels these mercenaries and captures them, but it's the organized people who see this as a threat of US imperialism, and we will not stand for US imperialism. Even though our nation is struggling, even though we're being suffocated by economic sanctions, we prefer to have control over our resources, over our land, than to have an occupying power like the United States try to come here and tell us what we want and what we need. So with that, I think I'll leave it. I think probably we'll get back to some of it maybe later on. I know Vijay and Nick and Sheri are going to talk about some really, really necessary elements about the elections and other things. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much, Zoe. I think that's a really beautiful place to start, and especially your question of like, what does a revolutionary project make possible, right? So next we'll be hearing from Reverend T. Sheri. So I'll turn it over to you, hear your thoughts on the current political situation and more. Thanks.
Good evening, everyone. I oscillated about what I was going to say about my heart. And my heart, I left a part of it in Venezuela. Being able to meet and be in community with such an amazing spirit of people, I was very humbled. And I was also very aware of my privilege. One of my mantras that I use day in, day out is a motto that was penned by Lilla Watson. And she said, if you have come here to help me, then you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you understand that your liberation is bound in mine, then let us get to work. And so I was compelled and inspired to be able to do liberation work for my family, my brothers and my sisters that I left there, being able to meet so many people from so many places. And there was a commonality of wanting the humanity of people to be acknowledged and to be better. I know that, as of earlier in 2019, I think it was January, we have no formal diplomatic ties, but we should. And we should not be implementing sanctions that is literally stealing resources and the ability for a people to be able to simply survive. I saw people, I did have on one of my Black Lives Matter t-shirts while I was there, and they recognized the organization, but they began to share with me some of their experiences. And they said that Black Lives Matter, and how affirming and humbling it was to have people dealing with such plight and yet offer such hospitality. Going to witness the opening of the polls, and then going and watching the process and the pride and the commitment that each person took in being able to participate and raise their voice, even in protest, if you will, as they were able to cast their votes. What I witnessed were people who literally they had law enforcement, if you will, that guarded each poll that we visited. And I wondered, and they said, we just want to make sure that the process is safe for everyone. And I was very humbled by that. And then talking to people, some people were emotional about the opportunity to be able to vote, a vote for change, a vote for themselves, a vote for their family. And so I thought how often, even myself, have taken for granted the privilege of simply being able to vote when I know that my ancestors and the lineage that I come from literally gave their lives. And we stand on the shoulders of those that fought for the right to vote. And so, how amazing it was to be part of the group that was just simply observing their technology using biometrics. Um, if the United States would implement that, we wouldn't have to wait to know that actual change had come, and that there would be a moron who would be moved out of the White House, because we would know, like they knew, within hours. There was no thought of voter fraud, because it really wasn't possible to do so, because they went in, they did show their ID, but they also signed in to vote by using their thumbprint. And so no one would be able to steal um, their vote. No one could pretend to be someone else. Um, and so each person was able to practice that. I asked questions about what happens when a person with disabilities or someone who is sick, because we're all in a pandemic all across the world. What about those that had COVID, that were not able to vote? And they said, we have this pandemic is something new for all of us, and they hadn't come to a process that they wanted to be able to make sure that everyone could vote. And they were disappointed and grieved by that. And I thought, wow, um, I wonder if we have that same unction to make sure that everyone's right is actually upheld to vote. I also got a chance to speak with some elders in the community. These amazing women who literally wanted to share their lunch with me while I was at one of the polling places. And so I am a foodie, and so I was able to accept some of their benevolence. And they began to tell me about the rations that they are given to survive throughout this time. And even though there was somewhat of a language barrier, I understand Spanish much better than I speak it. And there were people there that were giving interpretation, but it was very easy to understand and interpret the plight of mothers and grandmothers and aunts and daughters and sisters who were unable to make sure that their families simply had enough to be able to eat throughout the month because of what is given to them. One showed me a picture, and it was like the equivalency here in America, in Oklahoma, would have been maybe 2 packages of ramen noodle or spaghetti, some flour, a small packet of spice, some beans, and 1 or 2 other things that they said, this is what we make some of our traditional um, meals with. And I said, and this is just for one person. And they said, no, this is for our family. And that was for a family of 4. And I literally began to weep, because no one, no one should be hungry. Not here, not there, not anywhere, especially when the earth gives us um, what we need to be able to make sure that we can survive. And knowing that my country, and being accountable and transparent about the fact that we cause much of this, um, I dealt with the shame and wanting to ask them, can I give you the money that I have? How can we stay in contact, and what can I do? Being an activist, what can I do? Being in ministry, what can I do? Simply being a person who acknowledges the humanity of these people who had given their time to literally share about their lives, their culture, and some of the aspirations. And none of them offered the least amount of anger, the least amount of vitriol, hatred, um, fault. They told me to not feel guilty, to allow my heart to guide me in how they would be able to help. And they said that they just appreciated the fact that we were there to bear witness to them being able to participate in this process. Participating in that process also meant that many of them had to walk miles to get there. When we were traveling to some of the polling places, I saw miles and miles and miles of vehicles. And I got excited because I thought that this was like a surge to vote, like we did witness here in November and before in the early voting, where people were standing in line for 12 hours, for 16 hours just to be able to vote. And then it was explained that those people are not in line to vote. Some of the cars that you see that are empty weren't abandoned, but some of them had parked their cars to keep their space in line so that they could get gasoline. And some of them had left their vehicles with other people taking guard of it so they could go vote. And they said, well, sometimes they have to sit for 2 to 3, sometimes up to 4 days, simply to be able to get gasoline. And I knew then again that this was something that my country was also responsible for. And so I say that we do have to do something. It is our obligatory responsibility as persons who have conscience, as persons who understand that that Black lives do matter, and the Blackness that I witnessed in Venezuela was just encouraging, and I stood in awe of such beauty and of such a culture. I saw a sign at the last poll. It was, they might consider it graffiti, but I thought it was a testament to the spirit of these people. And I don't know if we can use expletives, but it basically said F Trump. And I mean, I literally cheered in a style of ovation when I saw it. And I took pictures. And many of us that were from the United States of America, we went over by that and took pictures. And people were coming up, talking to us, and congratulating us for having a successful election. And so part of the end of that particular day of watching that electoral process and watching how they closed the polls and the diligence and the pride that they took in making sure that everything was accurate. And they were in some of these polling places, they didn't have air conditioning and it was hot. And they said it does not matter because we wanted to make sure that everyone had the opportunity to be able to vote. And so our discomfort is never more important than democracy. How humbled was I? I have tears in my eyes right now thinking about how much I learned, the friendships that I made, thinking of my dear Fravia, who helped set everything up for us to be able to be there, Tulio, and seeing how the different organizations were working around the betterment for the lives of the Venezuelan people. And then I was also, I have to say, I was disappointed because we didn't get to attend the watch party or the electoral process at the end like we thought, because politics came into play, and a very small amount of the delegation of observers were allowed to go and speak. And it reminded me what it feels like to be disenfranchised. And that was very minuscule compared to some of the plight that I witnessed. And so I did fix my face and fix my attitude, and just say, well, I want to make sure that these types of things don't happen. I want to make sure that when I go home, I'm able to advocate to my networks, and use my platform to say that we have to help the people of Venezuela, the people in the Caracas that I saw, those that are indigenous, beautiful Black, brown, and POC persons. I ran into those that said that they were part of the LGBTQIA community, and I said, then you too are my family. And so it was just an amazing experience of becoming more aware, becoming more educated, and gleaning from the wisdom of a people whose tenacity and perseverance, and resilience is just astonishing in the face of such travail. I am encouraged. I am committed to helping supplement and sustain the people who are now my family, hoping to return soon. And I will say, as I began, that a piece of my heart will always remain in Venezuela, and we're going to make sure that media and technology will be able to be used so that this revolution will be televised, and we will not be robbed of the truth and of what is happening, so that the world could know where we need to focus our activism, our advocacy, and our extension of humanity to the people that I love, that I call my family. Ashe, beloveds.
Wow, I really love those stories that you shared, Reverend. So thank you so much. And we're going to turn it over to Vijay Prashad now.
Good evening. Great to be with you, to be with Zoe, Sheri, Nick, and Lou. Thanks for chairing this. Very proud to be on this platform made by the Red Nation. Well, we were in Venezuela again. This has not been my first trip to Venezuela. I've been to Venezuela since the 1990s and have watched since the 1990s the United States government attempt to destabilize and overthrow the Bolivarian revolution on a punctual basis, attempted coup d'etat in 2002, sanctions policy, suffocation, attacks at our great leader Hugo Chavez, attacks on Nicolas Maduro, personal attacks, quite racist and disgusting personal attacks, including when Joe Biden decided to use the word thug to describe Nicolas Maduro earlier this year. The word thug comes from my main language, Hindi. The word is a nasty word to use, and Joe Biden used it against a sitting head of state this year. So this is what the United States has pursued since 1998. There's been really no change of policy. It's been the same policy since that time. It's on behalf of mining companies and oil companies very eager to get their paws not only into Venezuela's hydrocarbons, the oil and the natural gas, but also into its minerals. I mean, Venezuela has large holdings of gold, of uranium, silver, other precious metals, and so on. Exactly the kind of attack that Bolivia was put against last year when the US pushed coup d'etat, brought in the racist coup regime of Gine Áñez against the very proud and successful government led by our brother Evo Morales Ayma, who led the government in Bolivia for 14 years and cut poverty rates down to dramatically, cut the poverty rates, was able to use the resources of Bolivia for the people of Bolivia. This major indigenous leader overthrown by a coup sanctioned by the White House, and then the Bolivian people decided a year later to vote in Lucho Arce, who was the economy minister under Evo Morales, and Evo Morales now back in his home country of Bolivia. You can try to overthrow a government, but it's not easy if the people are behind the government and the process. That's exactly what we saw in Bolivia, and it's precisely what we've seen in Venezuela and continue to see as the people, against all odds, continue to stand behind the Bolivarian revolution. This election, where I had gone as an election observer on behalf of the Council of CNE, the National Electoral Council, this election had 14,000 people run in 14,000 candidates from 107 parties. 98 of them were opposition parties. This was the 25th election in 21 years. I mean, Venezuela has too many elections in one respect, way more than any other country in the world. Out of that 107 parties running, there were 98 of them were opposition parties. And I got to meet leaders from two of the main parties. I interviewed the leaders from COPE and Acción Democrática. Now, these are important parties because between them, as in the United States, the Democrats and the Republicans, Acción Democrática and COPE ran the country from 1959 to 1999. So right up to the time when Hugo Chavez took power. For 40 years, these two parties were in power. I met the leaders of the party the day before the election in Caracas, and both the leader of Acción Democrática and of COPE said that there was absolutely no fraud. In fact, in that meeting also was a leader from a liberal party, Bruno Gallo. Bruno Gallo is a hilarious guy. He dislikes the government of Nicolas Maduro, dislikes the Bolivarian revolution. But what he said was very instructive. Bruno Gallo said two things. Number one, he said that, look, I've spent 10 years trying to find election fraud in Venezuela, and I haven't found a shred of evidence. He said, there's no election fraud. We just have a hard time running against this government. That's all. Because they have popular support. We have to defeat them amongst the people. We don't want help from Washington, D.C. The second thing Bruno Gallo said, and actually was accentuated by the leaders of COPE, Acción Democrática, Timoteo Zambrano, another leader, and so on. All of them seem to agree, including leaders of the evangelical parties. They all seem to agree that the problem Venezuela faces, the main problem, is the sanctions policy and the hybrid war prosecuted by the United States government against Venezuela. That's the principal problem. The second problem is the problem that a insignificant politician by the name of Juan Guaido was picked out last year by the United States government and was manufactured out of thin air. Manufactured out of thin air as the so-called legitimate president of Venezuela, when Venezuela has a legitimate president, and that president, of course, is Nicolas Maduro, it's not Juan Guaido. The leaders of COPE, the leaders of Acción Democrática, the leaders of the evangelical parties, all of them said, look, we don't recognize Juan Guaido. We don't recognize him at all. He's not the president of Venezuela. He's not the president of Venezuela. And furthermore, the actions of Juan Guaido becoming the puppet of Washington, D.C. has destroyed the integrity of Venezuelan politics. So for the last 5 years, the National Assembly has not been able to function effectively, which means that Venezuela has an executive led by Nicolas Maduro's government, but it has no legislature. So they said from the 5th of January, we want the legislature to come back in place so that we have a functional political system according to our constitution. So they want this legislature to function. They don't want it to be delegitimized. They are fed up, they said, with Juan Guaido's, shenanigans, backed fully, not backed, but his shenanigans as a puppet of Washington, D.C. They don't want that anymore. And these are people who dislike the government of Nicolas Maduro, but they want Venezuela to battle and do their political struggles within. They don't want it to go through Washington, D.C. I think that's a lesson for people in the United States. And I want to tell you that as we're speaking today, the Washington, D.C. has passed a COVID relief bill, and they're going to send checks, I believe, about $600 per person. You should know that in the U.S. Congress, they passed a bill this year, a defense appropriation bill, which handed $33 million from U.S. taxpayers into the coffers of Juan Guaido to conduct a regime change in Venezuela. They only sending you $600 ahead, but they gave Juan Guaido $33 million. Last year, the US government took money from Guatemala and Honduras, precious money that would have gone for relief in these two countries, took money from Guatemala, took money from Honduras, and gave Juan Guaido $50 million to prosecute a regime change agenda in Venezuela. That's what your government, the United States government, is doing against the people of Venezuela. It's using money that could go to COVID relief to do shenanigans which the people of Venezuela, including the opposition, the legitimate opposition, has no need, doesn't want to see interrupting the life of Venezuelan politics. Now, okay, you're excited Trump is gone. You're looking forward to Mr. Biden coming in. Mr. Biden's nominated National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, gave an interview. Well, rather, he talked to Walter Russell Mead of the Hudson Institute last year. And I was very, very chilled to read what Jake Sullivan said about Venezuela. And I want to put this to you because I understand there is, some, quite right, you're happy to get Trump out of the way. Who wants Trump anywhere near levers of any power? He's gone, but Biden is in. And what does Biden's nominated National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan say? Jake Sullivan said that, look, we understand that the direct military confrontation against Venezuela is not going to work very well. He said, we understand that. Well, that's good news. Thanks, Jake. That's good news. No direct military attack. But he said we're going to double down on sanctions. That's the word he used. Double down. That's the phrase he used. We're going to double down on sanctions. At our institute, Tricontinental, we consider the sanctions policy a form of war. We call it the hybrid war. This is warfare, economic warfare, information warfare, financial warfare against the people of Venezuela. You got to make it clear to this Biden administration that you will not tolerate the continuation, the prosecution of a hybrid war against Venezuela. You will simply not tolerate $30 to $50 million handed over to Washington, D.C.'s puppet Juan Guaido to continue the nonsense against the Venezuelan people. You will not tolerate that. And you shouldn't tolerate it. If you listen to what Sheri was saying, the people of Venezuela do not want to live under this sanctions regime. They are looking to the good, sensitive people of the United States of America to stand up and finally try to change the foreign policy orientation of the United States government. The United States government behaves like the international gangster. It's about time the citizens take control of their foreign policy, produce a decent foreign policy against this sort of mafia tactics used by Washington, D.C. against governments like Venezuela, against the people of Venezuela, against the people of Venezuela. The people of Venezuela do not deserve this. Thanks a lot.
Such a crucial input there, Vijay. Thank you so much. And just want to remind people, I think we sent it out, but there's a statement by the Progressive International against US-backed sanctions. So please click that, follow through, and also something we can return to in the discussion about how we can all hold the U.S. Accountable to these sanctions that affect a third of the world's population. So before we turn it over to our last speaker, I just want to remind everybody that we are collecting questions. So if you have a question, We're going to open up to discussion right after Nick speaks. So you can put that in like the YouTube comments on Twitch or Facebook, wherever you're watching this. And we will try and get to them through the course of the discussion. But last but not least, let's turn to Nick Estes from the Red Nation.
Thanks so much. This is a great panel. It's a reunion of sorts of Venezuela, and I'm happy to see everyone here today, and thanks for joining. Before I get into the discussion around indigenous elections in Venezuela, I just want to say that the Lakota Nation and a lot of the nations of the Northern Plains owe a debt of gratitude to the Bolivarian government. And so I had the opportunity last year in October of 2019 to actually thank President Nicolas Maduro for giving us heating assistance in the middle of winter. And this was back in 2007. And there's a connection to my talk because I met some people who were actually indigenous representatives of the Venezuelan government that helped negotiate heating relief for our people in the Northern Plains. So it was great. You know, the first time it was great to thank actual heads of state to say, you know, we remember you because you actually helped us in a time of need, not with, you know, ideological support, but actual material support, right? That kept us warm in these brutal winter months. And then I got to meet the indigenous Venezuelan representatives who actually helped negotiate that deal with indigenous people. And since Citgo, you know, and since then, Citgo has been, you know, seized by the United States government and has been broken up. But nonetheless, the project, the international project, especially for indigenous people, remains alive and well. And in Venezuela, indigenous people have their own elections. I had the opportunity to not only observe the broader electoral process, but also the specific indigenous elections that were very historic this year because it was the first time they had them in the traditional community style, assembly style of voting and electing people. And what's really funny about it is that there were some commentators online saying that the photos that we were taking were staged because there was indigenous leaders who were dropping their, very dramatically dropping their ballots into the ballot box. And what they told me is like, this isn't for show. They're like, we're used to actually voting in public and actually being held accountable by the people we're voting in front of about our electoral decisions. And so we wanted witnesses there to see us voting and casting our ballots, even though it's a secret ballot. So this is the first time that the indigenous elections have been held this way. Historically, they've been held in the kind of Western, secret ballot, one vote, one person, one vote kind of style. And the indigenous people have been, indigenous movements and councils have been pushing back against this, primarily because back in 2015, when the National Assembly was elected into office, there was a widespread criticism that the indigenous assembly people were actually elected through fraud. And I talked to many people who felt as if their candidate and their representative in their district, which is the Southern District, there's 3 districts there under the Bolivarian Constitution, indigenous people are allowed 3 permanent seats in the National Assembly. And in their district, the Southern District, many of them said, we never even went to the polls, so we don't even know who voted for this person. And the current president of the CNE, the election ministry in Venezuela, is Indira Alfonso, and actually challenged those elections of those 3 individuals. And this is, it was historic for them because they felt like they had the 2015 election stolen from them, that they didn't get the voice that they wanted. And in fact, there were 87 indigenous community councils in this region of Bolivar in the southern part. We were in a community called Santa Elena, which is right on the border, the Brazilian border. And I met with the elders in the community council of Santa Cruz de Mapari, which is a Pemon indigenous community. So there were 87 indigenous community councils that registered to vote in this particular election, and 45 were able to cast their ballots. So it was their participation in the elections actually exceeded the national participation by over 50%. It was a much higher turnout. And the reason why the other delegates weren't able to make it is because, as the previous speakers have mentioned, the gas shortages. And in this region, it's in the bush, and so it's hard to travel. Many of the delegates traveled by boat Some of them were able to secure airplane travel. Some of them spent days traveling by car to cast their election. Or to cast their ballots for their community, for these 3 indigenous candidates. And so 2 of the people I spoke with on the ground were very interesting. The first is Alejandra, and she's a traditional Paimon healer. She's also a public health expert and a trained nurse and clinician. And according to the Venezuelan constitution, and she pointed this out to me several times, indigenous medicinal practices are protected and promoted as long as they comply with bioethical standards agreed upon by the state and health ministries. And in this case of the sanctions, traditional medicinal practices have actually substituted the Western style of medicine, but they still, they obviously still are asking for more of that kind of support. And the other person I met with was Viviana, and she's the head captain of the Mapiri community. And she's in charge of, community security and community safety. And she's part of a council of 6 elected officials of that specific community, 5 of whom are women and 1 man, who are also selected by the community, as well as a council of 7 elders, all of whom are women. And they convene in a traditional indigenous manner, much like I guess a comparison would be a chapter house in the Navajo Nation, and that's where they make all their community decisions. And it's protected by the state, and it's protected by the Constitution itself. They have that right to organize that way, and it's a very democratic process, right? So one thing to give people an idea of the electoral process for indigenous people and how it's actually benefited and advanced their movements and their issues, we should look at the U.S. election process. So in the last election, or currently, there are 5 Native American U.S. Congress people out of 435 congressional seats. That's a little over 1% of all of Congress, when indigenous people make up about 2.4% of the general population, which is about 10 million people, constituting about 570 different tribes. In the Venezuelan National Assembly, in these most recent elections, 20 indigenous representatives, all of whom except for 1, I believe, were all women, out of 277 delegates were elected. And that includes the 3 guaranteed by Constitution. So you had 17 that ran as at-large members and were elected by the general population. So that's 7% of the National Assembly. And indigenous people in Venezuela only make up 3% of the population, with about 51 distinct indigenous communities or indigenous peoples, which is just under 1 million people total in the Venezuelan population. And this was a repudiation of the 2015 elections, where specifically in the South, where indigenous people felt like they had been disenfranchised by that electoral process by the opposition. And it's important to also point out, and Vijay touched on this a little bit, this region in the state of Bolivar is part of the Orinoco mining arc. And in Western media, they characterize it as a state-led project by Nicolas Maduro, and it's this mega project that's just destroying the natural landscape, and it's doing all these exploitative practices. But it's important to remember that the Bank of England seized 31 tons of gold worth approximately $1.2 billion that belonged not just to the Venezuelan state, but to the Venezuelan people, right? And in this particular region, it's also important to remember that 90% of the mining operations are small operations. Many of them are illegal operations. And historically, this area has been a mining hub going back to at least the early 19th century. So this isn't anything new, but it's been exacerbated by the sanctions regime, because there's 2 processes that are happening. There's an internal migration process where people are moving to the city with the promise of, teaming up with these illegal mining operations and making quick cash, or they're migrating externally out of the country. And this has created a lot of, social and economic problems for the indigenous communities. However, in this time, the Maduro government has actually, did something really monumental just this year. They returned a sacred object. It's called the Cueca stone, or the grandmother stone, that was seized by former president of Venezuela, Caldera, for a German artist, so that he could create this rock garden, right? And it's this massive stone. It's several tons, in weight. It's very large. It was actually cleaved in half. There's 2 stones that are together. There's the Cueco stone and the Cueca stone, the grandmother and the grandfather stone, and they were separated. And so under Nicolas Maduro and the petitioning of this particular indigenous community and the work of, the foreign minister, Jorge Ariasa, they were fortunate enough to actually negotiate a return. So even under the economic sanctions and the brutal kind of hybrid war being waged by the United States, there are still advances for the indigenous community. And I'd say that this is probably the largest object in history that has been repatriated back to indigenous people, but we hear nothing about it in the mainstream media. And this kind of, I want to wrap this up by connecting it to, the region itself, because the Venezuelan, the Bolivarian project is an international project fundamentally. And if we think about the most recent, coups in Honduras in 2009, or even the recent Guatemalan uprising, those uprisings, those coups or those actions happened because the people, specifically indigenous people, were advocating for a plurinational model, something, a constitution that was modeled or reflected or similar to the Venezuelan model or the Bolivarian model. And this is not liberalism. This is not constitutional liberalism. Nobody's invested in that process. There's no idealist aspiration of a flat equality that ignores class struggle and colonialism, or a homogenous kind of idea of citizenship. Theirs is a heterogeneity or a respect for the diversity of civilizations. And the day after the Venezuelan National Assembly elections, I had the opportunity of listening to former Bolivian President Evo Morales give a speech in Caracas. The topic was about the dialogue of civilizations, a concept inspired by former socialist Prime Minister Zapatero of Spain. There was no civilization, only invasion, Morales said, of European conquest of Abiyala. He used that term. It's an indigenous Central American term for the Western Americas, right? When the imperialists strike, he continued, it's not only against indigenous people. They strike against our model, right? It's not that they strike because they have this fear of indigenous people or brown people. It's because the Bolivian model, the Venezuelan model, actually represent real alternatives that threaten U.S. hegemony. So the United States' relentless decades-long frontal assault of Venezuela is a testament to this statement. Most recently, those attempts have been aimed at eviscerating the legacy of Hugo Chavez and the Bolivarian Revolution. With sanctions, a gas shortage, COVID-19, and a boycott by the opposition, the combined effects of a U.S. hybrid war, only 30% of Venezuelan electorate cast ballots on December 6th. And the parties supporting President Maduro won 68% of the vote and 253 seats in the National Assembly. And in the meantime, in the lead up to the elections, the Trump administration spent several months trying to defraud the electoral process, even going so as far as to sanction moderate opposition candidates. So they're not only sanctioning the Socialist Party, they're also sanctioning the opposition candidates. And mind you, this is this is Trump, the guy who's also delegitimizing his own elections. So it's important to remember that, as Vijay pointed out, moderate opposition candidates, like a majority of Venezuelans, oppose the sanctions that have been attributed to the deaths of tens of thousands of people, migrations of millions, and the daily immiseration of the poorest. But the opposition's proposed alternative of massive privatization of the economy has few supporters. And one person that I talked to during this electoral process he said something that actually stuck out to me. He says it's easier to vote and get a PCR test than it is to get a tank of gas. So there's not a lack of faith in the electoral system. But even with the economic sanctions, the elected executive and legislative branches have a mandate to govern. Overlapping forms of governance, which include indigenous community councils, reflect indigenous modes of governance and a possibility to continue the Bolivarian process to increase representation and rights for indigenous people. And so there is, in a sense, to evoke somebody like Frantz Fanon, a Manichaean view in the way we view imperialism and the struggle for decolonization. As Evo Morales said, there is an imperialist civilization and a people civilization. Life is sacred, he said, and that's the view of socialism. Thanks.
Awesome. That was, those were great words to end on, but to also begin our larger conversation around. I could honestly, though, listen just to stories of indigenous internationalist moments all evening. They make me kind of weepy, but also very full in the spirit. So thank you for sharing those. And we have about half an hour now for a larger discussion. We have our comrades still keeping an eye out on questions, so please send them in as you have them. We have one question from the audience that I'll start with. And while we discuss this, maybe the panelists can also think of any questions that they'd like to ask each other. But question from one of our viewers is here on the screen. Are the people of Venezuela, specifically supporters of the Bolivarian Revolution, aware of the propaganda that is pushed out about them by Western nations? So perhaps those of you who were recently in Venezuela could speak to sort of what the conversations are about how people in Venezuela see themselves being viewed by Western-controlled media.
I can. Oh,
Mine is very quick. I will say this. I don't know. I think the people are aware that there is a very deliberate and intentional mask or facade around what is actually happening in Venezuela. I was laying in the bed in my room watching CNN and another show that was from Venezuela, and literally a cover story came up about people who had passed away from COVID, and someone from Oklahoma City that I knew actually was part of that show. And so I became emotional because it was a beloved bus driver, Miss Betty. But I thought about, honestly, the people of Venezuela don't really care, in a sense, about what's happening all the way over there when they have their own plight. But this is what is being shown to Western civilization, and we're not being told the truth about what's happening. So it's very intentional and deliberate.
Yeah, I just wanted to say quickly that everyone I spoke to, because they knew I was a journalist, they said, I know you've seen a lot of things on TV in the United States, but we want to tell you about the real Venezuela. And so I think people are very, very clear what lies are being spewed, especially because within Venezuela, they do have corporate media. And there is a lot of right-wing media that does support Guaido, that does support the United States. And so they know exactly what they're up against. And they're very aware of the necessity of the battle of ideas and the necessity of combating not only media, but also US imposed culture. And so I think that's another really key thing to highlight, is that the cultural battle of reclaiming indigenous Venezuelan history and culture, reclaiming all of the diverse cultures within Venezuela against kind of the US imposed hegemonic culture is also super important.
Thank you. Any other responses to that question?
I'll just add briefly too. When I was in the community council building, and it's not really a building, it doesn't have any walls. It's like kind of fascinating, but one thing that everyone said when they presented to me, they said, take this story back and tell indigenous people what it's like to live under US sanctions, but also tell them our aspirations and the gains that we've made. And they said, we're revolutionaries, right? They were very explicit about that project. And I think in the United States, there's this contention between like the capitalist state and, you know, the gendarmes and the armed bodies of the state, and the way that they enforce that order and open up areas for privatization, or, you know, like there's a definitely antagonistic relation with indigenous people. And I believe one statistic said that 96% of indigenous people in the United States don't trust the government. But in fact, they were like, we need more government here. We need more protection for our sacred spaces and our places to live. And we also, you know, they're developing farming, agricultural projects, as well as forming their own popular defense forces, right? Because it's a very dangerous and violent region. And they see the army or the National Guard as the will of the people, versus like here in the United States, it's not the will of the people. It's something very different.
All right, we have another question from the audience that I'm going to turn to, and also relates to a question I had, so maybe we can kind of combine them. But somebody's asking if we can talk about solidarity regionally. How are other Latin American countries aligning to support Maduro? This person was thinking in particular of Brazil. And I was thinking when you were talking, Vijay, the word that you use, the very particular word, shenanigans, is also one that comes to mind often, actually, when I think of American imperialism. It just seems, I don't know, kind of a perfect description, although not to minimize also how harmful American imperialism can be. But thinking about, so what is the sort of counter project to American shenanigans? What is the Latin American response in terms of solidarity, but also in terms of struggling against this and struggling for self-determination against that U.S. imperialism? So if you could kind of give us that broad regional view.
Great, good question. But first, I'd like to say the opposite of good solidarity, because there is a class struggle internationally that I think people need to focus on. There's a thing called the United Nations, and there's a document that the United States and other 193 countries have signed on to, called the UN Charter. The Charter forbids regime change. The Charter actually explicitly forbids it. It says only in very limited circumstances under Chapter 7 resolution of the UN Security Council can member nations take action against other member nations. Otherwise, it's illegal. Well, in 2017, in Lima, Peru, a bunch of gangster political leaders who represent the oligarchies in their country, including Justin Trudeau, gangster number one of North America. He's gangster number one because he's this good-looking guy who thinks his charm is going to cover over the fact that he's a shill for Canadian mining companies. 60% of the world mining companies are based in Canada. People give Canada a pass. They should not give it a pass. It's a settler colonial imperialist country that pretends always that it's slightly better than the United States. Not when it comes to regime change in Venezuela. And in Lima, Peru, a group of these countries it's not really the Lima group, it's really the Bogota group, because it's led by Ivan Duque, now the president of Colombia. But these countries have created essentially a gang, a conspiracy to overthrow the government of Venezuela. This is racketeering, an illegal racket to overthrow a legitimate government. This is the definition of racketeering. And so you have this on one side. And remember, I said there's an international class struggle. This is going on one side. On the other side, you have countries which are attempting to use policies like resource socialism, attempting to develop the capacity of their people. It's not a surprise that in Caracas, when Zoe, Nick, Sheri, and I were there, you had Evo Morales Ayma of Bolivia come to give solidarity with the Venezuelan people, Bolivia. You had people like Rafael Correa, who used to be the head of government in Ecuador, was basically railroaded out of that country. And now you have a shill of Washington, D.C., Mr. Moreno, in power. But you had Rafael Correa, you had Lugo from Paraguay, who also experienced a hybrid war coup against him. They were there. I mean, the people of Latin America, in my opinion, stand with the Venezuelan people. Even large section of the Brazilian people are with the people of Venezuela. It's the governments that represent the oligarchies that stand with the United States and Canada against the people of Venezuela. And I'll tell you why it's important to look at Brazil. At the beginning of 2019, when the United States wanted to conduct regime change, a coup, in fact, in January and then in April of 2019, the vice president of Brazil was a former general. And he made it very clear in press appearances that the Brazilian army was not going to move across the border into Venezuela, because he realized whatever Bolsonaro's views are, the president of Brazil, whatever coalition they've mustered to win in Brazil, whatever is available to them, they can't move the army across the border because the Brazilian people are against it. They are against regime change in Venezuela. So when you ask what's the regional solidarity issue, I would say two things. One, there are some governments that represent the oligarchy that are for regime change. And then there are governments and the people who are against regime change, who give solidarity to Venezuela. And it's very important for the people of the United States to stand with the people of the American hemisphere against regime change explicitly, not passively, but explicitly.
Okay, this next question is for Reverend T. Sheri. It's about looking at the connections between the conditions for the Black Lives Matter struggle and Venezuelan struggle. So what are the connections that these two struggles are facing, and how can these inform the very necessary internationalism that Vijay was also just sort of gesturing towards? Go ahead.
The commonalities were staggering in the sense that the entire movement that started from a hashtag, which is a very simple sentiment, and is something that shouldn't have to be said, is that Black Lives Matter. We're simply advocating for a country, a people to acknowledge that our lives have value. And it's the same struggle that we've been fighting for over 400 years. And it's one step above just acknowledging the fact that we exist. The disenfranchisement that I witnessed and that I see that continues in countries like that of Venezuela, and that I witnessed in the faces of the people of Caracas, is simply saying that it is a human right to be able to live, to have sustenance, to have clean water, and to not live under the tyranny of state-sanctioned violence. They are dealing with those same struggles in very same capacity, with a few differences that we're dealing with here. And we're even dealing with interorganizational turmoil, in the sense that there have been our chapters, one of them, 10 chapters that took the lead, but there are many more that are supporting in asking about, shouldn't it be shared and collective power? Shouldn't distribution of resources be equitable? Those are the type of things that I think we can begin to push the needle and advocate for, not just here, not just within our own organizations, but internationally. I spoke with people from Argentina, people from Brazil, people from Barbados, people from Russia, and all of them said much of the same, that it should be people over politics. And how do we unite this thread of commonality, fighting for simple humanity, and brings more equitable power, and call a government and organizations to transparency, to accountability, and they understand that they're supposed to be working for the betterment of us, and not for very opportunistic situations for themselves, and creating a whole different type of caste system is what we're continuing to experience. And so we can tie those all together again by saying that we're going to keep giving voice. We're going to keep speaking truth to power. We are going to try to share our resources. And we're going to say, I'm going to say to my government that it is egregious and offensive and absurd that with the resources that Venezuela has, that we should not try to stifle their ability to refine their own oil, make them ship it off, it be refined, and sell it back to them when it's theirs. And it's very similar to what I'm experiencing and what we see here in Oklahoma, demanding that they just give the damn land back to our indigenous communities. Stop oppressing people. It's that simple. And they're going to see a revolution and a rise and a surge and all of those things that are going to continue until we are successful and victorious in actually taking the reins of power and it be placed exactly where it should be, and that is amongst each of us.
Heck yes. Thank you for that and bringing us to the rousing movement and sentiment of land back, and really drawing those connections. I feel like between the U.S. shenanigans, both home and abroad. Just want to kind of keep on this question a little bit of how we can strengthen these connections and really manifest the spirit of internationalism. And thinking about one of the questions I think that was posed by an audience or one of the viewers of what are sort of concrete ways that we can put pressure on the current Biden administration and the U.S. government to end the sanctions, specifically in Venezuela. But these are also sanctions that affect many peoples in different nations of the world. So this question's open to all of our panelists. Any perspectives that you have there?
I'd like to just build on what Sheri said. And first of all, people being in the imperialist core, especially social movements, we have a historic and unique task to hold this government accountable in the way it behaves in the rest of the world. There's a tendency often to weigh in on whether movements, elsewhere are doing the right thing, when in fact we haven't had that kind of success here, revolutionary success here. But it's also to say that the sanctions against Venezuela, especially when it comes to oil, are directly related to the development of oil and gas here in the United States and in Canada. You have an area the size of the state of Florida called the tar sands in Alberta, Canada, that has been completely decimated for the extraction of oil sands that will flow through oil pipelines through my territory, right? Here in the Southwest, you have the Permian Basin. New Mexico is the 5th largest oil producer. And, we're right next to Texas and Oklahoma. This area, like fracking in this particular time period, actually began, the fracking boom began under Obama. Under Obama's energy policy, he increased domestic oil production by 88%. And he unleashed, American energy independence, which was going to develop, the oil reserves to wean the United States off of Venezuelan oil and to choke out Iran and other oil-producing nations. And that happened at the expense of indigenous people, right? The economy collapsed in 2008, and Obama drilled the U.S. economy. So too did Harper and then Trudeau, drilled their economies out of the gutter at the expense of indigenous people in both, settler colonies. So we have to, and you go on the ground and you hear indigenous people, water protectors, making that connection. They understand the geopolitics. We're not stupid parochial people. We behave as citizens of the world, and we understand what we do when we're defending a pipe or when we're defending our land here, that it's connected to the defense of, the struggles of other people, especially in places like Bolivia or even Venezuela. And we can connect that, the lithium coup that happened last year. And I do want to say that, while we were in Caracas, Evo Morales made that very clear that was a lithium coup. And maybe Vijay can expand on that. But it's important to remember that as we go into this Biden administration, we have people, progressive, pushing the Green New Deal and, all of these environmental policies, that we have to remember that the United States consumes more than the rest of the world. and that we actually have more to learn about not only consumption, but quality of life and social well-being, and redefining what social development means, not based on material consumption and consumerism, but one that's based on social well-being and physical well-being. And we can see that happening right now in the Congress, when in the middle of a pandemic, even the progressive Democrats are abandoning the idea of a universal healthcare program. And it's like, if not now, then when? When 350,000 Americans have died of a preventable disease, when is the right time for socialized medicine? When is the right time to imagine a different system? And so I think it's incumbent upon us to recognize the limitations of the incoming and Biden administration, who's not only pulling former Obama appointees, but also continuing that neoliberal project. It's a project of neoliberal restoration, and we have to challenge that. And we have to challenge it, especially when it comes to the foreign policy actions against countries like Venezuela and in the global South.
All right. Sort of further related, there's a question sort of generally asking about what are all the panelists, predictions or expectations for how the U.S., this current Biden administration will act towards Venezuela in the coming year. Is anything bound to change, or is this going to be sort of the same approach as always? Any thoughts in that regard?
Well, Lou, what do you think? I mean, it's the US government. The US government since 1776 has been an imperialist government, a racist government as far as the world is concerned. I mean, Barack Obama became the president. He had the Nobel Prize in his back pocket when he became the president. And then he decided that he'll innovate by droning the area where my family is from, which is Waziristan. Let's kill as many people who look like Osama bin Laden. We don't need trials for them. This is a man who is a constitutional lawyer, just did death sentences to hundreds of people, and then decided on the advice of Hillary Clinton and Nicolas Sarkozy to destroy Libya. I mean, what do you expect from Mr. Biden? Who has he chosen in his foreign policy team? Antony Blinken. Antony Blinken is going to want to destroy many more countries. These people are messianic in their imperialism. I already mentioned about Jake Sullivan. You see, Ilhan Omar has a bill that's pending in the Congress, which is a congressional oversight of sanctions. We don't need oversight of sanctions. We need the US Congress to forbid sanctions. I would like to see Cori Bush and Karen Bass and AOC and Alana Presley and Rashida Tlaib and Omar. I mean, I can recite their names. What's the point of reciting their names if they're not going to act against US foreign policy? It's not enough to stand up in Congress and talk about domestic policy. You can't fund your domestic policy if you're wasting $33 billion on Juan Guaido's pet project, or you're spending $1 trillion on your military. What's the point of having a domestic policy? American progressives make this mistake every time. They focus on domestic policy as if you can do domestic policy when all the money is siphoned off to the gangsters in the arms industry. And look at what they did to the UAE. They gave the UAE a $23 billion arms deal, Morocco $1 billion, and sold out the people of Western Sahara, Sahrawi people, sold out the Yemenis, because the UAE is bombing Yemen, and sold out the Palestinians, all three in one go for arms deals. These are the people that control the US government. I'll be quiet now because I'm going to ask people to call up these progressives, whatever they claim to be progressives, call them up. Tell Cori Bush, who's a fantastic person, so forthright and so deliberate in everything she says. I would like to see her walk into that Congress and make a very strong speech against sanctions. I would like to see Karen Bass stand up there. And perhaps if they do that, Barbara Lee will lead them, into getting 20, 30 people in Congress to put a bill forward condemning, forbidding sanctions, illegal sanctions. By the way, you might want to read this book that Claudia de la Cruz, Manolo de los Santos, and I edited. It's just out. It's called Vivi Ramos, Venezuela versus Hybrid War. It's a really good book. It has fantastic essays. Yes, I know I'm plugging a book, but so be it.
I'm gonna buy the book. If I don't already have it. Two, exactly what Vijay just said. I expect great things. I trust the Black women. I think Black women should lead, and when Black people and as Black women rise, we all do. Um, this is the time when we have to literally push and demand more than just a very small section of justice. The hashtag that we use here in Oklahoma and Oklahoma City, because Oklahoma is like number one in officer involved fatalities. We're number one in incarceration of Black people, and Black women have been for over 15 years. We're number one in privatized prisons. We were number one in fracking incidents and all of these things. And we're also been number one and number two as far as an oil and gas state. Our hashtag is stop killing us. The people of Venezuela can say that to their government. They can say it to the United States, which continues these sanctions. All people of color who have been oppressed can say the same thing, and any other marginalized group. It is very simple. Stop killing us. Stop doing the things that drain the life and the resources from the people that you are supposed to represent and supposed to serve.
Hey, I just wanted to share something pretty short. There's an article that came out last week talking specifically about this question about what will be the Biden administration position towards Venezuela. And in this article, it stated that a close advisor said that the Biden administration is willing to revisit sanctions. However, the conditions that are supposedly being put forward are that new elections be held and other such restrictive conditions. Of course, these conditions are, unilateral and do not actually incentivize dialogue. However, it is showing that there are cracks and that there is a possibility that with, concerted effort and pushing, that there may be an opportunity for a new policy. On the other hand, also this article mentioned that Juan Guaido has supposedly solicited many meetings with Biden and other members of his cabinet, and they have not met with him yet. So I think, at least on one hand, it is likely that both because the Guaido character is also fading in terms of he has no political legitimacy. He is no longer he will no longer be an elected representative of anyone as of January 5th. And so I think this is a possibility, of course, though. It doesn't matter if Biden doesn't recognize Guaido if he still won't lift the sanctions. So there are cracks, there are possibilities, but of course it needs a lot of sustained pushing, a lot of sustained efforts, and a lot of, efforts by us to make sure that these sanctions get lifted and that the U.S. recognizes the baseline sovereignty of Venezuela and the Venezuelan people.
Yes, thank you. So crucial, right? There's cracks, but we have to really get in there and push them open, make things possible from below. We just have one more question from one of the viewers, thinking about international solidarity against sanctions, but in particular, those that severely impact indigenous and proletariat-led efforts of food sovereignty. And I wonder if this applies to some of the settlement projects and communes that you were also speaking about earlier, Zoe, or if anybody else has any insight on this specific question.
Is somebody coming in? Well, look, here's the issue. When Chavez came to power in 1999, when he took office, one of the things that he was most determined to do was to change the eating culture in Venezuela. The oil industry over 50 years had, in a sense, brought in a kind of diet which is alien to the Venezuelan ecology, landscape, and culture. You know, you may not know this, but until the sanctions kicked in a terrible way, Venezuela was one of the 3 leading countries that used to eat processed pasta. When you went into a grocery store, you saw aisles of pasta. By the United States, Venezuela, and Italy were the 3 leading countries. All that pasta was imported. No domestic grains were eaten. But Chavez was very interested in pivoting away. But you've got to understand that changing people's habits is very hard. When you go to Venezuela today, what is the big drink everybody's drinking? They drink Coca-Cola. It's hard to pivot away from old food habits. So it has been difficult for Venezuela, and this is not something you can put on the, on the doorstep of the Bolivarian Revolution. This goes back 80 years when oil was first brought out of the ground, when oil wealth was first spread to some sections of the population. They started importing most of the food that they eat, which is now still creating a problem given that the external revenue is so low as a consequence of not being able to sell oil. So when a question is asked about food sovereignty, Venezuela already started on the back foot for food sovereignty. But during the pandemic, and during the sanctions period, there's been a great attempt to build the farm-to-table food industry within Venezuela. It takes time, though. It takes capital. It takes a lot of resources. And there's just not the time and capital to do this in the middle of the pandemic, which is why Venezuela continues to be a net food importer. It's something that people need to take seriously. That is the reason why when you walk into Chavista areas, people will tell you that they've been losing weight very fast because their nutritional intake has gone down. They simply don't have the food in the country. So pay attention to that, guys. I mean, you can't say how to defend food sovereignty if you haven't had a long-term culture of building food. And of course, there are, as I said, a lot of innovations taking place in the last maybe 15 years or so, including organic food production, what they call agroecological food production. This is an enormous part of the project of the Bolivarian Revolution, but it takes resources. And if you have a blockade of the country, this sanctions project, it undermines the ability of the Venezuelan government, of the Venezuelan people, to pivot out a culture of oil-dependent importing food. That's what Chavez very much wanted to get away from, and it's hard to get away from if Jake Sullivan and these other officials of the Biden administration are going to, as Jake Sullivan said, double down on sanctions.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think bottom line is that all initiatives are greatly hampered by when there's any kind of sanctions regime strangling the economy and strangling all possibilities. However, even amid this really, really challenging panorama and situation, there are really beautiful examples of international solidarity. I mean, we can look to the landless rural workers movement of Brazil. They have a permanent brigade in Venezuela since, I want to say 2004, 2005, and they have been building alongside the Venezuelan people, Venezuelan popular movements, grassroots movements, to be creating, projects of agroecological production. Chavez famously was in Brazil and saw one of the settlements of the MST and said, "We need this to happen in Venezuela." And that's when the brigade started. And since then, they've been doing, really important work in terms of building seed sovereignty, in terms of educating people on not new techniques, but, historic and ancestral techniques to be able to farm the land, to know what are the crops that work in certain climates. And so more and more, we're seeing a lot of these projects crop up in the communes. There's a lot of agroecological projects within the city. The mayor of Caracas, Erika Farias, has a really extensive and really impressive urban agroecological plan that's being run across the city. The city is, of course, an urban area, but there's a lot of rural space. And so they've been able to reclaim some of these rural terrains and are attempting to work towards a food sovereign future. And so I think these are also really important initiatives that, while suffering under the most murderous blockade that we've seen, they're still able to innovate and continue to build people's power.
I think that's, I just really want to emphasize what you've drawn out there, that despite, this hybrid war and everything that it has wrought, that the Venezuelan people have accomplished so much for each other. And for the national struggle. So I think that it's amazing to think of what more would be possible, if these sanctions were lifted, and how incredible and beautiful that would be, and how important it is that all of us who believe in what could be accomplished really fight against those sanctions. Are there any last comments or thoughts from our panelists before we wrap it up for the evening?
I just want to say thank you to the Red Nation for this opportunity. I am elated to be able to have this reunion of those that are now my comrades and accomplices in this fight. Vijay, I want to tell you, when I was there, I drank water, and I'm still drinking the water from Venezuela. I took half of my luggage and left my clothes there, and I brought the water home with me. So I'm still drinking it. And I want to say to the people of Venezuela who may be watching this, and the people here, even with what little that they have, being a socialist country, they took the money and they put it back into taking care of the people and caring for one another. And hopefully we will be able to mirror and emulate that same type of humanity.
What I would like to say is that you had put in the chat, I think, the statement of the Progressive International, which is condemning unilateral criminal US sanctions against 30 plus countries around the world. This is a very important statement. I would very much hope people who watch this circulate it to their friends. We need to put pressure on the United Nations. It's not enough for the United Nations to say these are illegal sanctions. The UN has to come in there and provide an avenue for Venezuela to freely trade with the world. The government of Nicolas Maduro has created a new system, a blockade law, where they are allowing companies who are too scared of trading with Venezuela because of the secondary and primary sanctions. They're trying to give them some stealth, some cover, so they can trade with Venezuela without being found out. That's the reason why there's a secrecy provision in the anti-blockade law. This law is highly misunderstood overseas. There's a lot of malicious talk about it. People are saying that this is a way that the government is privatizing and so on. It's a totally malicious interpretation of the law. This law is there in order to enable companies outside Venezuela to freely trade with the country without being hit by primary and secondary sanctions. So I very much hope people don't just spread, knee-jerk things on social media about the anti-blockade law without studying it carefully, without understanding the context, and without understanding the suffocation of this US-imposed blockade on the people of Venezuela.
I'll add something briefly too. And I think it's important to not just think of Venezuelans or the Bolivarian process, the revolution, as some kind of hapless victims of US imperialism. And while it's important to imagine, what this process could look like without sanctions, it's also important to underscore what has been accomplished even under the hybrid war and US aggression. And that's something that's, worth defending and worth saving as indigenous people, as people part of social movements, as leftists, as socialists. This is something that's worth defending and also learning from. And so this is like we're just scratching the surface of, the complex nature of the political process. And I just want to say that in the United States, again, we have, nothing changes without struggle. And we can't just rely on the benevolence of somebody like Biden. I just have that picture of him eating ice cream. That's his foreign policy. That's Biden's foreign policy in this moment. Imagine that's your enemy. But nothing changes without struggle. And the movements in the United States and within the imperial core, we have a special responsibility. And if we took this to our movements, our social movements, our unions, our organizations, and had these conversations, I would say the vast majority of working people in the United States would be sympathetic to this particular, what's happening in their name, and the immense amount of resources that are being spent in times of crisis, in times of mass eviction. Millions of people are facing eviction. Millions of people have lost their jobs, and this is the priority of your government. You should be ashamed. You should be appalled. You should be outraged that this is happening in your name, and that it's happened in your name for the last 2 decades at least.
Yes. All right. I hope everybody feels fired up and a little bit more aware of the recent events in Venezuela and also the larger history in which it is unfolding. I'm really grateful to be able to have heard all of your perspectives and stories. A little bit jealous. I do hope to visit Venezuela one day. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. And for those who want to hear more analysis and conversations like this, I'm very honored to be a member of the Red Nation. I feel like we hold space for these kinds of conversations often, and you can hear more of our analysis and interviews on our Patreon. If you go to patreon.com/therednation, become a supporter there, you'll get access to a bunch of bonus stuff that's not just on the podcast, but the podcast is also great. And if you become a supporter there, you can join this thing called Discord, which I'm not on yet, but maybe if enough people join, I'll go over there and see what that's all about. So yes, please find us, seek us out. We use the support that you all give us on Patreon to fund our mutual aid projects, and also just build a better and more leftist indigenous media sort of analysis than is out there currently. So want to thank all of our panelists. Thank everybody for joining us. Have a beautiful evening, everybody.